On the 31st of January 1923, Scott Field, Illinois opened a giant new hangar, big enough even for a rigid airship. First home to non-rigids, the U.S. Army recovered from the tragedy of the ROMA and began designing a new semi-rigid airship, the RS-1. Work began inside the Scott Field hangar in the spring of 1925, as the components were delivered by rail from Goodyear in Akron. The airship's triangular keel would distribute the weight of the fuel tanks, engine cars, and control cabin along the helium-filled envelope. The keel would also act as the main passageway between the control car forward and the twin engine cars amidships. Each engine car contained two new Liberty 12A engines, turning a 17.5-foot wooden prop. RS-1 would be the largest semi-rigid airship ever built in America. Italian airshipman Umberto Nobile received an elaborate reception when he arrived to help the Army effort. Nobile was developing his own large semi-rigids back in Italy and offered his expertise to the U.S. builders. Construction and inflation of the RS-1 was dogged by lack of manpower and funding. The first pilot in charge was Lieutenant Orville Anderson. Just as the Army had observers aboard Navy airships, RS-1 hosted the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics lead airship designer, C.P. Burgess. The airship finally made its first flight from Scott Field on January 8, 1926. On the 18th of September, 1926, RS-1 became the first airship to moor to the tower mast erected by Henry Ford at Dearborn, Michigan. Henry Ford saw the airship as the ultimate in long-distance travel and had become friends with Hugo Eckener during his earlier visit to the United States. RS-1's nose slipped into the cup, and the airship rode the air currents comfortably 175 feet above the ground. The forward mast featured many innovations, including a provision to lower the masted airship to ground level. While the design philosophy seemed sound, not all the airshipmen trusted it, and the lowering feature was not used. RS-1's crew became concerned about an approaching weather front and undocked for the trip home. The Army would never visit the forward mast again. At home base Scott Field, the Army erected an enclosed steel tower mast, and the RS-1 would mast there on several occasions. RS-1 would also make flights to Brooks Field, Texas, and Langley Field, Virginia, and even visit New Jersey. At Lakehurst, the Navy finally accumulated enough helium to replace that lost with the Shenandoah. The Los Angeles resumed flights under a new skipper, Shenandoah survivor Lieutenant Commander Charles E. Rosendahl. Plagued with aging cells that leaked helium every day, the ZR-3 was handled carefully. Some flights calibrated radio stations, but there were still some publicity flights fostering interest in rigid airships. The Lakehurst Engineering Department continued to improve the water recovery condensers, and Los Angeles continued her role as flying testbed. Careful records were kept on engine performance, speeds, and fuel consumption, because the Maybach engines required overhaul after only a few hundred hours of operation. On October 15, 1926, less than a month after the Army's visit, the Los Angeles moored to Ford's mast at Dearborn. Ford flivver pilot Harry Brooks could not resist buzzing by. Rosendahl kept the ZR-3 attached to Ford's mast long enough for the newsmen to get their pictures. The large, rigid airship was at home in the air, but keeping it from being damaged on the ground was a major challenge. The ground handling problem seemed to be partially solved with the tower mast, originally developed in England. The high mast allowed the airship to ride with minimal crew aboard. The British airship program would build elaborate mooring masts at bases in Cardington, in Canada, in Egypt, and in India. With the expected boom in airship travel, what better place to put a mooring mast than atop New York's proud new Empire State Building? Navy blimp J-4 paid a visit to the mast under construction. A massive traffic jam ensued as New Yorkers thought a mooring was about to take place. But the winds aloft made an airship mooring a risky venture. No actual mooring ever took place on the skyscraper. The height of the tower mast made servicing airships difficult, and a minimal crew had to stay aboard. On August 25, 1927, Los Angeles was moored to the tower mast at Lakehurst with only a watch crew on duty. A sudden temperature change and sea breeze lifted the stern. Before corrective action could be taken, the airship did a nose stand. Damage to the airship was minimal, but photographers had captured the embarrassing incident. The high mast was seldom used thereafter, its last use being in October of 1929. The nose stand experience hastened the development of the low, or stub, mast. The first attempt was nothing more than two poles spliced together. Later, with a steel mast, the Los Angeles No. 1 engine was shored up, reinforcing beams, and a taxi wheel was added. It could weather vane around on its lower engine car along a hardened dirt track. Meanwhile, the Italians had completed another semi-rigid airship, the N1, 348 feet long and 62 feet in diameter. NORGE. It featured three 250 horsepower engines. In 1926, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen and American sponsor Lincoln Ellsworth hired Italian General Umberto Nobile to operate the N1 for the attempt to fly to the North Pole. On the 11th of May, the NORGE flew northward from its roofless wooden hangar for 16 hours to circle the North Pole, dropping ceremonial items. The NORGE flew 1,500 more miles across the top of the world to a safe landing in Teller, Alaska. Landed skillfully with local Eskimos, NORGE was packed for the shipment home. Nevertheless, the magnificent achievement would be overshadowed by American Richard E. Byrd's claim to have reached the pole by airplane one day before, now widely questioned. Meanwhile, on January 27, 1928, Los Angeles participated in a unique experiment. The aircraft carrier USS Saratoga laid a course into the wind, and the Los Angeles approached to touch down on the deck. It was a tricky maneuver, since the two ships were moving in their own medium. Several landing attempts were made before the big rigid was secure enough to conduct a simulated crew exchange and gasoline refueling. The experiment proved the flat top made a possible, if reluctant, rigid airship base. The airship tender USS Patoka provided a more suitable mooring for naval operations. While moored, the airship had to be under the control of a flight crew and handled if it was still in flight. There was a danger of wind and tide pushing the ships in opposite directions. To lessen the chance of the tail being dipped into the water, the Patoka's mast had been raised 30 feet in 1926. But even this was no guarantee of safety, for the Los Angeles dipped her tail in the water on one occasion in 1931. Crew interchange was possible via a nose door and ladderway. Small hand-carried cargo could be exchanged, and the mast provided connections for fuel, water, power, and helium. Ground handling a rigid airship always requires hundreds of men, with the station's personnel sometimes supplemented with locals. Close to its shed, trolley-like handling carts kept the airship aligned with the hangar. The idea of making the experimental stub mooring mast movable was given form as the Lakehurst engineers developed a heavy steel tripod version. Vehicles powerful enough to pull the crawler tread mast substituted for manpower. Later improvements to the mobile mast allowed some services to be provided through the bow connections. On a typical mission, the Los Angeles would undock early when the winds were the most calm. Still warm from the hangar, she would lift off into the prevailing breeze. The chow on the Los Angeles was a far cry from early airshipmen heating their soup on the engine's exhaust manifolds. Breakfast included stewed prunes, bacon and eggs, bread and coffee. Lunch might consist of fried pork chops, corn, applesauce, and oranges. A typical dinner would be ox tongue, beans, tomato and cucumber salad served with bread and jam. Returning from a mission, landing circle smoke would indicate wind direction, and the airship would approach into the wind. Commands from the bridge were relayed back to the engine cars via circular telegraphs. If the wind was not sufficient to slow the airship, the telegraph would relay the command to stop the engine, operate its cam lever, and run the engine in reverse. The technique of the high landing was developed, allowing the airship to maintain a safe, tail-high attitude, while the nose was winched down into the mooring mast's cup. Over in England, conversion of wartime Zeppelin copies into passenger airships was not fulfilling the dream of an empire connected by air. R-33, which had suffered a Mast breakaway flight like that of Shenandoah, had been brought back safely and repaired, but she never flew again. Zeppelin copies were abandoned in favor of new designs that would be built stronger than the feeble R-38. On the 15th of May, 1928, the new Italian semi-rigid airship, the Italia, set out again to conquer the Arctic from Spitsbergen, this time without foreigners. Umberto Nobile again commanded the airship. Red paint containers were used to check the barometric altimeter with true altitude on the featureless plains of the white ice. Reaching the pole on the 23rd, Italia circled to return, but something caused a massive loss of lift, and Italia crashed into the ice, breaking off the car and dumping out most of the crew. 6 men drifted off with the remnants of the ship, never to be seen again. The U.S. Army's semi-rigid RS-1 had been beaten up badly in a storm. Its keel and cars were placed in storage in hopes of getting a new envelope. The world's only operating rigid airship poked out of the clouds over a rainy inaugural parade for President Hoover. The USS Los Angeles was escorted by the Navy's J ships and Army TC ships. A 3-airship armada was later duplicated for Frank Capra in the making of the film Dirigible, starring Jack Holt and Fay Wray. The story concerned 2 Navy men, one in airplanes and the other in airships, competing for the affections of the same girl. The future of the rigid airship seemed bright as the roaring 20s came to a close. But few people saw the coming of worldwide economic depression.